that the humanized landscape and designed parks and gardens are amongst the most precious inheritances that any country can have. They need to be cared for, they need to perhaps be restored, and then sometimes they need to be changed to meet contemporary requirements. So we all have a task of conservation, and part of that task is the garden historical task of revealing significance, which of course is absolutely fundamental. And I think probably you'll find that all the best conservationists are also pretty fair garden historians. The AA actually has a surprising but very distinguished history in landscape architecture, because there was an early AA student called Calvert Vaux, who was the person who designed Central Park in New York, and he was also the world's first landscape architect. And he was a predecessor of people like Barbara Sims and so forth here at the AA. But nowadays the AA is an international school with students from around the world, and somehow our conservation course is accepted as part of this polyglot experience. What I now want to do is hand you over to the chairman of the Architectural Association, Mohsen Mostafavi, who will give you the formal welcome from the Architectural Association. Mohsen.
Thanks, David. Good morning. I'm glad to see so many faces here on this wet and cold day, and that so many people have preferred to be here than watching rugby. I've just been checking with Joel, and for those of you who are interested, I think the latest score is 14-11 to England. So we will keep you up to date, I think, throughout the morning with the results. I really want to thank Robert Peel for doing such a wonderful job of organizing this great symposium on Humphrey Repton, and it's great also for us to be collaborating with the Garden History Society on this project here today. I remember many years ago, actually, as a student going to the AA library and coming across this wonderful book, which I then discovered was one of the red books, and being amazed at the kind of incredible directness of one of Repton's red books, which now I've been told by David it's the one on Hilton in Cheshire, and seeing these images of sort of before and after, and noticing how amazing it was, the kind of pragmatic directness of the artistry of Repton, being able to, in a sense, show to his clients what they had and what they were going to get, and thinking that obviously an incredible sort of shift had happened from the tradition of Italian Renaissance landscape painting to these almost pop-up books in some sense, because I remember seeing or having a few of these as a child, and always being fascinated with this shift from the two-dimensional flatness to a kind of three-dimensional imagination. And I think probably since then I've always been fascinated with the relationship between the 2D, the two-dimensional, and the three-dimensional in a way. And I think some of the work that happens in the school, it's still very much fascinated, probably now more theoretical and more polemical in terms of the investigation of the relationship between two-dimensional and three-dimensional work. But I think that we're still sort of amazed at how these books really manage to convey an idea so directly, and probably a lot of architects today could learn quite a lot from the idea of being able to understand the relationship between an insertion or the notion of a project in relation to its context, in relation to a place, so that the place is really at the beginning, part and parcel of the making of the project. So obviously I'm very much looking forward to the presentations. I think David already mentioned something about the AA's commitment to the field landscape generally and landscape conservation specifically. And I know that there are a number of alumni and current students and staff here. And it is, of course, the conservation program is a program that has been going on for a number of years, and I would certainly recommend it to those who have an interest in the field. And if you have friends who you think would be interested, I would very much appreciate it if you could recommend our program to them. Anyway, without any further delay, I would like to pass the baton to Dominic, the chairman of the Garden History Society, who will be chairing the morning session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohsen. It's a great pleasure for the Garden History Society to be hosted by the Architectural Association. As a guest, I've been given a great job of announcing the housekeeping details. So we start with lavatories. The lavatories are all downstairs, as is all the food. So the refreshments that you had when you came in are the only refreshments that will be served up here. So all the rest of the refreshments are downstairs. If any of you are vegetarian, can you make yourself known to Robert Peel during the coffee break? There is a broken dryer in one of the lavatories, but it has been reported. Right. As I say, welcome to everybody. It's fantastic to see so many alumni of the Architectural Association, so many GHS members, and it was rather like walking into sort of one of my first garden history conferences many years ago, when there are so many familiar faces. So it's rather nerve-wracking to be standing in front of you and welcoming you as chairman of the society 20 years later. But fantastic to see you all. And it proves to me that the subject is still very much alive. And it's a great pleasure today to be able to celebrate one of the greats in garden history. Incidentally, in welcoming members of the Garden History Society, I'd also just sort of do the normal advertising and say that if anybody is not yet a member and finds the day so fantastic that they feel they've got to join the society, do come up to me and get a leaflet off me, and do join if you're not already a member. There are some 120 people here today, which is extraordinary. I think it does show that when you have a great man such as Repton, we all want to be a part of it. And I sadly and happily can say that we're really paying tribute to one of our great garden historians who sadly died a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Nigel Temple, who, as those of you who know him, he was a great Reptonian, and he was going to be speaking here today. So we're in a way paying tribute to Nigel at the same time as paying tribute to Mr. Repton himself. The oleaginous Mr. Repton, the fantastic watercolourist, the great advertiser. You think you know someone, but you perhaps don't. And today we've got an opportunity to get to know that person a bit better. So it's a great pleasure for me to be introducing first speaker, Derek Adlam. He was last at the AA 37 years ago to give a harpsichord recital. And he's since had a career as a musician, a musical instrument maker, and a conservator. The latter occupation took him to Welbeck Abbey in 1982 to take a workshop under the aegis of an arts educational charity, the Harley Foundation. And from there, he slid sideways first into administration of that charity and ultimately into the curatorship of the Cavendish Bentinck Dukes of Portland art collections based at Welbeck Abbey. And he's as keenly interested in gardening. He is keenly interested in gardening as a fine art. So, Derek, welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Conservation of gardens is such an interesting topic because of all art forms, gardening and its variant, landscape gardening, is made of perishable materials. So change is an inherent element in a historic garden. The process of change and decay must be accommodated into the process of conservation and renewal. So really, with garden conservation, one is dealing with the conservation of the original spirit of the creation, rather than necessarily with its actual fabric. Now, Welbeck is unique in having 3 of the Repton pop-up books. The first 1790, the second 1793, and then a third actually written for the Marquis of Titchfield, the heir to the third Duke of Portland, in 1803. But the family had been based at Welbeck since 1606, when the great Bess of Hardwicke's third son, Sir Charles Cavendish, was able to acquire the freehold of both Welbeck and Bolsover Castle from his effective brother-in-law, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury to be. Sir Charles Cavendish was succeeded by his son, William Cavendish, who is best known to us as the loyal Duke of Newcastle, the great cavalier who went into voluntary exile after the loss of the Battle of Marston Moor, and he sat out the Civil War in Antwerp, living in Rubens's house. But in 1629, he commissioned a great surveyor, William Senior, to prepare an atlas of his estates. And if I've got my number, was this the right way around? No, it's upside down. I will try to get these right as we go through. Okay. The 1629 survey of Welbeck gives us a very good view of the park, which is basically the 900-acre park which became the subject of the later landscape developments, ultimately by Humphrey Repton. Here you see the house itself with its original formal garden, and here the river, really the confluence of 2 streams, running down a shallow valley. Here there is an area of ancient woodland that still survives, and here the land rises rather more steeply than on the western bank. I should point out that north is to the bottom of this map. We're going to have considerable confusion with maps today because the points of the compass whirl around. But this particular area here is the one which interests us today. This is actually a topic for an entirely different conference, but you see here a scrap view of the abbey shown at the centre of the landscape. Just to give you an idea of what was constructed there by both Sir Charles and William Cavendish, we have the Hall Beck coming in from the west and the Mill Brook from the north to provide all the water for a very elaborate water garden enclosed within a variety of walls. I suspect that this code of alternating red and white squares is a broad wall on which you could walk, so a viewing wall surrounding the various garden enclosures. Here is a canal within the main garden. Here's the south-facing range of the house, so the largest and most formal part of the garden, canal running across the centre, and 2 water houses straddling the canal. Those are almost certainly designed by Robert Smithson, and then there is in fact a surviving drawing of a water house supposedly for Welbeck, and I suspect that it is that building there, again, straddling the beginning of another ornamental garden. We should pass very quickly on from that, because as I say, this is a topic for an entirely different conference. But I suspect the garden was like a miniature rustic form of the garden at Fontainebleau, and may even have been designed by, or at least after, the Francini brothers, who were responsible for much of the work of Fontainebleau. we pass into the 18th century, and the Welbeck estate remained part of the Cavendish lands that were inherited by the second of three 18th century heiresses. The middle heiress was Lady Henrietta Cavendish Hollis, who was married to Edward Harley, the great collecting Earl of Oxford. His father was Mr. Speaker Harley, first Earl of Oxford, great scholar and collector, bibliophile. But his son, Edward Harley, was a prodigious collector and bibliophile, and Dr. Johnson described his library of printed books as the finest library that had ever been assembled. And his library of manuscripts after his death actually formed the cornerstone of the newly established British Library, in fact, the British Museum, which, and that part of it became the British Library. If you ever see a reference to a Harlan manuscript, it was Edward Harley's. He drank himself into an early grave in 1741, having virtually bankrupted himself with his collecting. And his widow, the Dowager Countess of Oxford, retired to her ancestral Cavendish home at Welbeck Abbey and began its restoration. In 1748, a rather shadowy figure, Francis Richardson, carried out a survey, or rather prepared a map in 1748. We suspect that the survey is earlier because considerable expenditure was being incurred by Francis Richardson. But it does preserve the remains, or show us the remains of that pre-Civil War water garden. The cascade is still there, and the formal groves behind, to the, have I got this? I probably got this map upside down. Yeah, I think it's right. The formal groves there, and the canal in front of the, yes, it's there. The canal in, no, there. The canal on the, because south is at the front again, top end. There's the canal of the pre-Civil War garden. It's very, a very interesting survey map showing us the the 16 garden like the 1629 map, but, and this is a very unclear map, I fear. It was made for use and is very worn. But this is a contemporary map, also by Francis Richardson, showing the design of the new Arcadian landscape garden that was to succeed the formal garden. And it draws in the entire 900-acre area of the inner park. The estate of Welbeck itself was very much larger than that, and it remains very much larger than that. But this is the paled park, which is given as 900 acres. We now have south to our right. So we are now looking along the river valley, which it is proposed will have been dammed. That is a main road between Mansfield and Worksop, and it forms the boundary where the dam is to be built. So the whole valley is flooded. Now you won't see this very clearly, but from the house itself, three vistas are very clearly defined. One from the south-facing range of the house in this direction up to an eye catcher here, from the east rooms of the house, which were the principal state rooms, at least by the mid-18th century. There's a great vista leading right across the park to an eye catcher located somewhere there. And there is a third vista running roughly parallel with the lake, going up to a kind of semicircular exhedra, opening onto the gate onto that road through the park. So we have three very carefully calculated vistas through the park, but much more important, there is a deliberate clumping of trees throughout the park, controlled woodlands, and two areas of very beautifully designed ornamental shrubbery, very detailed with serpentine walks, and running around the entire garden is a boundary drive or walk. It goes right round and returns through what we now know as the wilderness to the house. This is the area of ancient woodland shown clearly in the 1629 map, and it still survives today. So we have all these characteristics of a very highly developed landscape garden already drawn up in 1748. I'll just show you a detail of one of the shrubberies which gives quite a clear idea of the sophistication of the detail. And that is to the southwest of the house there. This is partly a surviving remnant of the pre-Civil War garden, converted into a kitchen garden. But here is this wonderfully romantic shrubbery with its serpentine walks, some kind of building there, elegant, presumably poplars. It's a very sophisticated design. And that actually was put into effect. So the origins of the design are unclear. We don't know who Richardson is. There are a few other records of him working on other landscapes, but there is one little bit of circumstantial evidence which might be of interest. The Cavendish family owned great estates in Northumberland that had come into the family with the mother, I beg your pardon, the wife of, yes, that's right, with the wife of Sir Charles Cavendish, a great oval heiress. And during the lifetime of the Cavendish family, the mid-18th century Cavendish family, the agent in the Northumberland estates was one John Brown, and his brother happened to be Lancelot Brown. So it is just possible that at Welbeck we have a Brownian landscape garden. Brown would have delegated a great deal of his work. It's possible he delegated to Francis Richardson. We have absolutely no traditional link of the Welbeck garden with Brown, which is surprising if he was indeed involved. But it's possible that the link with Brown was literally forgotten. If Repton had known about it through his conversations with the surgeon of Portland, Repton would certainly have mentioned it. So we have no evidence that Brown was involved other than this curious link with the Northumberland estates of the Cavendish family. And I suspect that we are looking there at a very early Brown garden. And it was indeed put into effect, not exactly as the Richardson design asked for, but the valley was flooded. South is to the right again. The valley was indeed flooded. There is the dam along the road there, the stream continuing downstream. Here are the carefully defined areas of woodland to the west. The vista running roughly parallel with the lake is there. There is no vista to the south. So it's, at this stage, is not in a very refined state, but it has certainly been put into effect. We believe this map dates from 1766, and it is called a rough map of Welbeck. A less rough map I have never seen in my life, but it is in fact incomplete. And so that is perhaps why it's called a rough map. Now, we have here then the evidence of a fully developed landscape garden of the late 1740s, being put into effect gradually during the next decade. And there is one rather telling detail that, in fact, I noticed only last week as I was preparing myself for this talk. And that is this structure here, which I hadn't identified before. I suddenly realized, although it has no associated road, it is a bridge. And it is a three-arched bridge, which I'll come to in just a moment. Now, luckily, at Welbeck, we don't need only to depend on estate maps. But in 1765, the third Duke of Portland, then established at Welbeck, living there. Although he was the Duke of Portland, he had actually come to an agreement with his mother, the Dowager Duchess of Portland, that she would live at the Cavendish Benting seat of Bulstrode, and he would live at Welbeck. His mother was a very forceful character, and he was very amiable. So he agreed to go to damp Welbeck while she went to live at Bellygram Bulstrode. But he loved Welbeck, and in 1765 he invited the Irish painter, landscape painter, George Barrett, to come to Welbeck to paint a sequence of paintings, of which we still have 10 at Welbeck, and about 6 of those depict Welbeck itself. And what we can get an idea of from these paintings, I'm sorry, these were very quick shots done in flashlight. It's very difficult to photograph these paintings at the moment. But what we get is a very clear idea of the nature of a landscape such as Welbeck at the precise moment that this great landscape garden was being developed. It's wonderfully fuzzy. There's a certain roughness and rural quality to it that I find very attractive. Here is another view. I'm not quite sure where this is. This might in fact not be on the Great Lake, but on a lake further downstream, which already existed. Now, it wasn't an ornamental lake at all. It was an industrial lake. It was the product of an iron industry which had been established in 1695. And the forge had been revived right at the end of the 17th century and remained in production until about 1783. So all during the period that this first phase of the landscape garden was being developed, but before Repton came to Welbeck. And this may in fact be a view of Forge Dam, the lake which would have driven water hammers and the like. This is a view of the Great Lake, the great artificial lake, looking down south towards the dam, and with the old kennel buildings behind. It's possible, in fact, that the dam, this painting had been done when the dam had been, of the Great Lake, had been moved downstream a little further, because I cannot work out the exact viewpoint for this painting unless it takes into account an extension of the lake that was already in existence when Repton first visited Welbeck. But the most important view of all in this series of Barrett paintings is this one. Which actually shows the abbey itself lying close to the head of the Great Lake. This is the Great Lake, and here is the three-arched bridge. We're rather lucky to have that three-arched bridge depicted at all, either on the plan or in this painting, because it was put up one year and fell down the next. It was one of the Duke's more unsuccessful little extravagances. But again, what I want to point out, here we have the hillside clumps and all the woodlands coming down into the valley. Here's the ancient woodland that I've mentioned on the Lucerne map. There is a softness to this landscape, and a kind of richness. And it is so different from the kind of parody of a Brownian landscape that Oakdale Price, for example, criticized. There's nothing shaven about this landscape. It is soft, it is rural. It's magically romantic. Now, Repton first comes to Welbeck in 1789. I'm putting up the map that he drew for the second of the books, the 1793 book, because it gives us a very clear, that's sufficiently in focus, it gives us a very clear idea of the way in which the garden had developed after our rough map of 1766, and also, of course, passing on from the paintings by Barrett, which were done in the mid-1760s as well. Here you see that the dam, which would have been here on the 1766 map, has been moved downstream. And here we have this arm of the lake that we know as the duck decoy. And I believe that the Barrett painting is from this viewpoint, just by this little wood here, looking across to the kennels there. That's the old kennel building. And so I think that was the viewpoint of the second of the Barrett illustrations I showed you. And here we have evidence. This is the James Dowling survey of 1793 that appears in the second of the Welbeck books. And here we see exactly the same contours of woodland as on the 1766 map. The careful placing of individual trees and clumping throughout the park. Here is the area of ancient woodland. Here the house. South is still to the right. Now, I've emphasized the actual history of the landscape because it does play such a very important part in what comes later. I believe that Repton's principal activity at Welbeck was a process of refinement, and also he was called in to make alterations to the house. And the Red Books demonstrate his ambitions as an architect who realized the importance of integrating buildings with landscape. So he had the talent of a very considerable artist, but he was also very architectural in his thought. He visualized in 3 dimensions and attempted in his designs to achieve a unity between buildings and landscape. In fact, he says as much. Now, of course, we all know that in the Red Books he uses a very, I think I heard the word oleaginous tone. He's quite obsequious. He's very polite. Even though with the 3rd Duke of Portland, he was on extremely good terms of friendship, and his first visit was in, as I said, in 1809, which is only a year after he took up his professional practice as a landscape gardener. And those visits, which were about a week long, continued for many years, annually. And they were as much social as professional. He and the Duke got on very well. And he acknowledges that he was much influenced by, he claims, what the Duke had discussed with him and the Duke's own taste. I suspect that, although that may be partly true, he was probably being influenced by what he found at Welbeck. That is, the artificial landscape which had been designed initially in 1748. The introduction to the 1790 book is absolutely typical. The great, my Lord Duke, the great style of improvement which your Grace has with so much good taste and on so bold a scale adopted all around Welbeck leaves me no other opportunity of displaying my skill in my profession than that of entering into the more minute detail of carrying out your Grace's own ideas into execution which is all the following pages pretend to suggest. And if it shall appear that they contain nothing but what has been before proposed, I hope it will not be attributed to the sterility of my invention, but to the impossibility of producing new ideas on a subject which Your Grace has had opportunities of studying. So, I mean, wonderfully oleaginous. So, as I say, how much was the Duke's taste and instruction, and how much Repton's response to what he found at Welbeck is open to discussion. But what's absolutely clear from the 1790 pop-up book is that his overriding concern is to integrate the house and the garden and create a single artistic entity and a unified statement of an aesthetic effect and mood, and he really was a master of that. Now, it's with the 1790 book that he actually establishes the entire modus of those books. The 1790 book is, I believe, the first of the red books, and the form is complete. To demonstrate just how Welbeck, and particularly the view down the Great Lake, had an effect on Repton, we only need look as far as his trade card, which is viewed into the 1790 book, a little watercolor view of Welbeck, again from the 1790 volume, and then a very similar watercolor in the 1793 volume. That's there as a repetition because of my lack of mastery of the computer. But the trade card and these two watercolors show a very close relationship. And it's interesting that he should have chosen for his trade card an interpretation with a little bit of poetic exaggeration with this, and an excessively steep hillside here with one of his pet delights, a tower. They're always justified because they make very good accommodation for gamekeepers. But one of his principal exercises, and the first exercise in Welbeck, was with the house, not with the landscape. And here we see the first of his pop-up devices, what he calls the slide. And this shows the entrance front of Welbeck Abbey in 1790, a distressingly bleak and bald-looking house. The house was always criticized. It was simply a conglomeration of buildings that had been adapted from monastic remains. The monastery dissolved in the late 1530s, and then added to piecemeal. Every generation of Cavendishes has treated Welbeck Abbey as a palimpsest. It's a document that's been scribbled on by every generation, right up to the 20th century. And this was the very distressingly bleak and bald entrance front, the west front. It had been very exciting during the lifetime of William Cavendish, but I fear the 18th century rationalists have been at it and removed all its romantic charm. The Piano Nobile is the first floor level there, and in what we know as the Oxford wing, this projecting wing here, which I believe incorporates possibly the abbot's dwelling from the monastery. Repton does one of his cleverest conjuring tricks with this particular landscape, housescape. He proposes this, and in fact he has hardly altered the house at all. What he has done is to change the level of the ground. And again, to persuade his clients, he undertakes very careful surveys of the landscapes that he's about to improve. He's done very careful sections and survey of this area of ground here. He noticed there is a ridge, he believes artificial at this point, and then the ground very gently slopes up to the north. The great criticism, the artist hasn't actually captured one thing. The house is actually lying in a hollow. And Repton very cleverly hollows this out further and banks the land up against the house to bury the basement story. And so with the slide removed, you see here that the land has been raised to the piano nobile level, which he says, paradoxically, because you approach the house on a slope upwards, it will make the house look more dignified and important. He swept away this rather piddling little brick pediment thing here, stone pediment, and he has turned that into a square battlemented tower, and then added 2 pavilion towers at either end of the facade, incorporating, certainly in this one, existing chimneys. And he points out that this would in fact be all remarkably cheap. This doesn't go down terribly well with the Duke, who is disappointed to think that 5 minutes? Yes. He doesn't like any suggestion that he should be guilty of any economy. He doesn't want second best. His agents, William Gold, who was his Welbeck agent, and the Chatsworth Cavendish agent, Heaton, they were terrified of the third Duke's expenditure. And indeed, all this work was going on at a time when the Duke was heading for a major financial crisis. Repton was right. His works in this series were supposedly to cost under £1,000. On this initial work, the Duke spent £3,000 with a completely clear conscience, but to the terror of his agents. Just to show how careful Repton was in calculating it's upside down, it is indeed upside down, the actual technique of burying the basement story. There is the existing ground level going down to the front door. Here is the proposed ground level, burying the basement story. And carriages would no longer approach the house directly, but would go around in a sweep within what would appear to be a courtyard. In fact, it returned the front door to the proper level where it had been in the 17th century. A flight of steps had taken visitors up to the screens passage via a rather grand doorway and approach staircase. Now, of course, I have prepared enough material for at least an hour and a half, I'm calculated. But although I have a great deal of more material which may come into discussions later, I just wanted to show how he also was a master of illusion. This is a screen of the kitchen garden, which is now behind the abbey here. And it's just an ordinary screen that has been planted, but he proposes pulling forward projections and spurs. Because he says, let me see, I can't find the little bit, but in fact what he's saying is that through partially obscuring the lawn, so the viewpoint, supposed viewpoint is here, but by partially obscuring the lawn from the viewer, the imagination will suggest that it is of greater extent than it really is. And so everywhere you see Repton developing this idea of illusion. And just to demonstrate how clever he is, the feeder stream for the Great Lake passes the house, and Repton suggests that in fact the lake should be continued past the house to a much higher level upstream. And so here we have the scene before, here his proposed view. Now, this is a weir. For the sake of economy, not approved of by the Duke, for the sake of economy, he only excavates this area. This is a weir, so flooding the shallow valley to the north. And there are two weirs, one here that is higher than this one here. Repton suggests that this shall be a weir where the water flows over broken stone, so that when viewed from the house, the water will catch the light and sparkle against the shadow of these trees here. And everywhere you see him using this kind of poetic imagination, I have to stop there. I have no more time. But this is just a very brief introduction to the first of the Welbeck books, which establishes the pattern of demonstrating the wonderful ideas he has, although also demonstrating that in the whole of Repton's work, it is Welbeck and the work he has produced in these three red books, which he draws on through the rest of his career. Welbeck, I believe, does, to a very large extent, form his taste and forms his style. Thank you.
Derek, thank you very much. I do apologise for cutting you off in your prime. I had the normal chairman's shakes when 20 minutes into Derek's presentation we hadn't actually heard about Mr. Repton. But what a fantastic and enthusiastic exploration of the material that you have at your disposal at Welbeck, and a great introduction to the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I did forget to say my personal thanks to Robert Peel, Diana Renard, and Chairman's gone bonkers, to Lou Cooper for organising the day today. That was a gross omission from my introduction. Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to speed on. We do have an opportunity to question speakers both during the breaks, the buffet, and at the end of the day. Unfortunately, we don't have that opportunity in between speakers. So without more ado, we shall move on to André Rogger, who is an art historian. After his MA, he worked as a curator for the Museum of Fine Arts in Lucerne for 5 years, and in 1999 was awarded a grant for undertaking a PhD on Humphrey Repton's Red Books, a grant given by the Swiss National Science Foundation. He's planning to submit his thesis in December of this year, and he has recently taken up a lectureship at Lucerne Art College. So, André, he's disappeared. Welcome.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for introducing me. I'm very pleased to be here this morning to participate in today's conference on Humphrey Repton. Repton's Red Books have accompanied me for some years. Rather than using the Red Books as a source providing evidence for Repton's gardens that were so often lost, I've concentrated on the impact of the Red Books as such, trying to find out what exactly it was that turned this unique genre into such an influential medium in garden design. In August 1788, when Repton set out to make his business as a landscape gardener, he sent out a circular letter to friends and potential clients. In it, he offered his services, stating the theoretical and practical grounds for his claim to professional expertise. He said, "I've been advised to render my leisure profitable by a profession. Mason, Gilpin, Whately, and Girardin have been of late my brewery, and the works of Kent, Brown, and Richmond have been the places of my worship." Possibly because in that quotation Repton's voice seems to say all one needs to know about his sources, I think that another of Repton's important depths has been largely overlooked. It is widely acknowledged that Repton, before turning landscape gardener, had been professionally engaged as a commentator and draftsman of country seats. For instance, when providing text entries and drawn views to be engraved for Richard Armstrong's History of Norfolk in 1781. I wonder, though, whether the lasting impact of this genre of the illustrated topographical account has been given enough attention in Repton studies. I show 4 of these, I think about 20 drawings that mostly were engraved later for publication in that book. The watercolors, obviously. Thus, in the first half of my talk, I would like to assess its relevance for the shaping of Repton's Red Books. I will in particular examine Repton's obligation to the collection of William Watt's Seeds of the Nobility and Gentry in a collection of the most interesting and picturesque views from 1779 to 86, and to a lesser extent, the slightly later Seeds of the Nobility and Gentry in Great Britain and Wales by William Angus. Later, I would like to expand this discussion of the impact of these illustrated seeds collections on the shaping of Repton's Red Books into an assessment of the importance of drawing for Repton's relations with his clients. Published by the engravers William Watts and William Angus in the 1780s, their seeds collections met with lively interest of subscribers. Oops. That's a double spread page from Angus's compendium. Watts' Seeds, for instance, lists, as the subscriber list in Watts' Seeds, for instance, lists well over 500 names. As is common practice in the late 18th century, the volume's 84 engraved plates and accompanying text entries on the seeds of the country's social elite were only bound into a permanent cover by the individual subscribers. Yet all copies quite naturally show a similar sequence, placing an engraved view opposite its descriptive text, either opposite or following. So as we see here, it can also be afterwards. When turning to the Red Book, of which the first one appeared 3 years after completion of Watts' Seeds, it is rather obvious that Repton's newly introduced medium closely follows this very same layout. The unusual oblong quarter size that arose so naturally from the printing format of Watts' copper plates was adopted by Repton, though there is no obvious necessity for him to have done so. Likewise, Repton used a similar juxtaposition of text leaves with framed sketches for the argument of the Red Books. More significant than these external resemblances of size and layout, however, is that Repton seems to develop his text argument along lines similar or familiar to him from publications such as Watts. When introducing a place, William Watts' Seeds used a descriptive pattern geared to his purposes of supplying a vademecum. Firstly, the geographical place is situated for the readers, most often in terms of its distance from London. Then usually follows a brief account of previous owners or a history of the estate, which implicitly determines the social importance of the present owners too. While some descriptions stop here, others move on to a characterization of the general impression an estate evokes when first approaching it. An analysis of the house's architecture as the visitor steps closer may come next, followed by an assessment of its merits and beauties, which quite naturally leads on to a conclusion discussing other attractive features in garden and park. Briefly then, a sequence of impressions is described as they might unfold to traveller or visitor when approaching an estate and its house. Repton, who usually supplied his Red Book after a first visit of a couple of days only, in the analysis he makes in the Red Books, also tends to follow a sequence of impressions as they open up to the visitor. I have here all the illustrations and the cover of a Red Book I chose, a random sort of. It's a Henham Hall in Suffolk Red Book from 1791. After a dedicatory introduction letter, he begins with an explanation of the topographical situation of the place, which is, of course, on the map, and then in the commentary. This leads on to a characterization of the general effect of the place, pointing out... No, sorry, that was wrong. He begins with an explanation of the topographical situation of the place, pointing out its landscaping potential, which leads on to a characterization of the general effect, pointing out what is appropriate to change. Repton then remarks on the approach, these pictures and this. on the approach from the Turnpike Road, discussing appropriation features such as lodges, for instance, and comments on the appearance of the house from this approach before moving on to improvement proposals for the architecture of the house, offices and stable buildings as such, if he has been asked to supply such advice. He always discusses views to be achieved from the house and concludes with a critique and proposals for drives and walks in the park, as well as other park features such as plantations, water or picturesque beauties not previously tackled. So that is the view from the house. Then there is a map of the things in the garden, the attractive features in the garden, which here is a church and Wangford Mill as picturesque eye catchers. Then, of course, the tree, the oak in full vigor as an asset of an estate, and then sort of a valley view. And last, sort of a reminiscence almost, a sort of priory, a sign of antiquity, of course, which also adds to the status of an estate. Among the Red Books, this catalogue feature can be discussed in a different order, but remains essentially the same for all places, providing a checklist or a taxonomy of criteria to be measured in a place, most of all when improving it. As his publications explicitly state, Repton keeps striving to establish such a general taxonomy, against which an individual country seat's aesthetic qualities could be classified. It is hardly surprising, and it is telling for the importance Repton attributed to his Red Books, that they could be used as a matrix for such comparative assessment between estates. In them, he not only established a checklist of criteria to go through, he also increasingly standardized the technical feature of the Red Book in terms of cover, flyleaves, manuscript leaves, and watercolor layout. Hence, as it were, not only the estates, but even the medium of the Red Book presented itself in a chain of similar pearls, and as such became comparable with its mates, at least until Repton was abandoning his standard format after 1800 by producing upright folio volumes with more ambitious programs and different treatments of text and image. Even more than the criteria of the argument itself and the format under which they are presented, however, it is an external perspective that links the Red Books and the Seeds collection. Repton, like Watts, approached an estate as a professional observer, pointing out the felicities and infelicities of what may have been obscure to gentlemen owners who possibly lacking an aesthetic judgment and often unable to look at things from the distance needed to make such unbiased assessments. Repton, in fact, often refers to future impressions of a place as he wishes to convey them to a stranger, a traveller, or a visitor. It was, in fact, an important reason for the immediate acclaim of the Red Books that in them Repton joined two discourses that until then had been led by two very different groups of authors. His ideas, in his capacity as a garden designer, the production side as it were integral to his reflections of how future visitors, like travel authors, or indeed guests and friends, would potentially view and judge an estate. Even though Watts and Repton obviously had different aims, the Seeds collections of course did not suggest improvements, but rather recorded and praised the status quo. They both rooted their descriptive argument in the same soul, assessment of the character of any single place in terms of its social importance. The evaluation of place could be adequately made only in a larger context. Watts' collections of 84 model seats of the country's nobility and gentry presented an ample visual and textual corpus to facilitate comparisons and to identify subtle distinctions. This national perspective is very much echoed by Repton's well-known endeavour to integrate the plays he was dealing with into a grid of nationwide commissions, either by quoting from other Red Books or indeed by explicit comparative statements, such as in the Red Book for Mulgrave in Yorkshire, for instance, 1793. In this Red Book of 1793, Repton presents his suggestions as a part of his encompassing strategy to make this place, high over Whitby Beach on the North Sea coast, as interesting an ornament to the north of England as Mount Edgecombe is to the south. This national perspective, and hence comparisons of the states, were a key factor in Repton's garden designs. As Stephen Daniels in the first chapter of his book has shown, houses became seen from the road, as improved road transportation need not least encouraged leisure travel dramatically, so that by 1821 Carey's new itinerary for England and Wales could indicate no less than 1,000 gentlemen's seats which could be seen near the main roads. And so Oops. Well, and so it seems only too understandable that it is also the view of a house from the approach, or the perspective of a traveller. That Repton favoured when making his choice of drawings to be used for the engraved monthly vignettes in Peacock's polite repositories, of which I have given here a selection of 10 samples of typical approach views that are in the context of a red book. When turning to Repton's red book sketches, boundless narrative motives seem to have been inspired by engravings such as Watts or Angus's, geared to an audience of travellers. Whether a group of ladies and gentlemen leisurely gathered in the foreground, here, with or without an umbrella, or a visiting coach swiftly approaching the mansion from the Turnpike Road, as we have it here and we have it here, as these are plates from Watts' compendium, and these are red book sketches, the one for Sunning Hill here and one from Heathfield in Sussex. Such details, ubiquitous in Watts' engravings, appear as frequently in Repton's sketches. In fact, when Repton in his mid-career rejects the Brownian idiom of placing a Palladian house in a smooth, verdant all-over surface, he also seems to defy Watts' engravings that had paid their homage to this point of perfection in modern gardening. I'm very glad that this book was already mentioned. This one is the one that is here in the house, the one for Houghton in Cheshire, of which I have taken 2 views here. In a sketch showing a view of the house from the approach in the Red Book for Houghton Park in Cheshire, 1802, Repton not only seems to wish to improve the estate, but also the engraving which, 20 years before, had praised this very same scene from the approach road to Houghton as a becoming role model. So we have here the engraving from Watts' compendium, which was done in, between 1779 and 86, and here we have the watercolor by Repton of 1802. As I said, before and after view, of course, this was flapped down, the existing state, and here with the flap raised, giving the state as he suggests it to be. By taking the 2 front trees out of the picture, a flat view, devoid of any spatiality, arises in whose composition no one would have denied some need for counteracting the cubic form of the house and changing the unsatisfactory arrangement of a stately home standing too naked in the grass, as Repton advocates in the Red Book. He takes that tree out. And that's it. When, however, his design for Houghton Hall was not implemented, Repton just as effortlessly finds a way to improve the nakedness in Watts' view. In a vignette of Houghton Park, published in William Peacock's Polite Repository of 1804, Repton puts the repoussoir tree back that he had previously taken out of Watts' view, and by adding another small tree in front of the house and some sheep in the foreground, I'm talking about this and this, a Brownian nakedness that Watts' view portrayed is alleviated by Repton's compositional skill. In fact, Repton also flattened the cubic form of the house, which was slightly exaggerated in the Red Book sketch. But to pursue these comparisons would lead us into quite a tricky issue, the topographical reliability of Repton's sketches, which question is not at stake here. The influences between Watts, Angus and Repton were, however, mutual, particularly when we remember that Repton had himself supplied 2 drawings for Watts' seeds collection, respectively for Angus' similar compilation of a few years later. Certainly, one unidentified owner of a copy of Angus's 2nd edition of the Seeds of the Nobility and Gender in Great Britain and Wales of 1815 was strongly aware of a mutual close link between the genres of Repton's Red Books and the Seeds collections. He enriched his copy of Angus's Seeds with a watercolour that Repton appears to have painted as an encore to his Red Book for Sundridge Park in Kent of 1793, and which in 1804 became the source for Angus's engraved plate of Sundridge Park. So I show the the original sketch of the Red Book, which shows what Repton proposed in terms of the house, improved the architecture of the house. Yes, and then a few years later, actually, he was asked to provide another sketch, which often happens, but which did not actually make part of the Red Book, or it's not obvious whether it did make part of it, in which he moves the house because John Nash had joined in. So this is the former house, which is the improved state of the previous sketch, and then when you lift the flap or take it away, then you have the new house. And this new house, of course, is shown in Angus's engraving later. But what happened was that the watercolor was not stuck into the Red Book. It may not have been the same owner anyway, but it was included in Angus's compendium here. You see, this is the printed text of Angus's seats. The original watercolor by Repton improved a Red Book sketch, which was previously the permanent situation for the new house. And this extra sketch of Repton's is tipped in opposite the printed page of Sandridge Park, where it, like a valuable extra gem, has replaced the far less prestigious copperplate engraving of Angus's standard edition, also which would be this. So it's this now. Even though it is difficult to say when exactly Repton's itinerant single watercolor found its present place in this copy of Angus's Seats, it is important to note that the extra illustration of printed volumes, of which we have just encountered a small-scale example, was by no means an unusual practice at the end of the 18th century. Named after its most influential promoter, James Granger, this very popular pastime of Grangerizing had from 1760 onwards been focused largely on enriching biographical histories with single portrait plates, but the practice was later extended to topographical works. Publications designed to appeal to antiquarian interest were especially suitable for being individualized by adding one's own choice of illustrations, such as prints, drawings, or watercolors, as they may have been assembled or made on a journey to their respective sites. John Britton and Edward Brayley, for instance, provided a special title page for their 18-volume The Beauties of England, Scotland and Wales of 1801 to 15, which could replace the standard title if an extra illustrated copy was wished for. So with a choice selection of engravings. So you could make it as big as you wished. I think there are copies which go up to 100 volumes. Okay. Also, the Red Books use a similar principle of montage. As they needed to be painted on smooth paper, Repton's watercolors Repton's watercolor sketches were painted separately and subsequently mounted on stubs between the manuscript leaves of the Red Book. As you can see here, he often says if there is sometimes they were not tipped in, and then you can still see what he writes on the stub to say what illustration was meant to be there, or here you see it. This procedure of a montage is the more pronounced when Repton in his early Red Books included merely anecdotal sketches, as in Hoken, for example, or indeed decorative views provided by other artists. This one here from the Cobham Red Book, which was provided by George Samuel. Also, he embellished the title pages at some point, and I've included this illustration here just to give an idea of an individual manuscript which had been extra illustrated. This is all handwritten and illustrated by prints. And I don't know if you really can actually see it quite well, the frame and the copperplate rating, it's all very much in the Red Book style. This is also a travel account, an individual travel account, just like a diary sort of, but which has been enriched by these prints. Generally, the distinction between book and manuscript, so clear to us today, was not as definite in the 18th century. Not least due to a craze for choice book bindings in late Georgian England, of which the name-giving red morocco for Repton's Red Books is only a modest variety, there were many possibilities for not only embellishing but also personalizing a book, characterizing it as a bearer of one's own interests. John Brewer has pointed out how generally the appreciation of personalized books soared after mid-18th century. The book had ceased to be merely a text and had become an icon and object which conveyed a sense of its owner. It is fascinating to observe how how cleverly Repton appropriated specific interests of individual commissioners for use in his red books, so the former could, to quote John Brewer again, engage in that most genteel of avocations, good conversation, and enter into a dialogue with their own highly customized red book, as it were. Indeed, the red books, even though always primarily concerned with improvement advice about the house and its grounds, expand their discussion into a myriad of other thematic areas, of which the polite art of drawing only is one. It is, however, one that keeps reappearing, and one also which the Seeds collection had encouraged their readers to pursue. In Watt's commentary on Chiswick House, the amateur draftsman is emphatically warned of an unusual, illiberal injunction at this place: upon admission, you are prohibited from making any drawings, with disobedience resulting in a very disagreeable treatment. Well, surely Repton never encountered such disagreeable treatment when taking the picture of an estate. We may indeed note that when portraying himself in one of his red book watercolors, he is often engaged in the very process of sketching. We can repeatedly see him sitting as a draftsman in the foreground, as here, the classical formula of an artist reflecting on his own doings. Indeed, Repton may have been inspired by the corresponding renderings of, for instance, Claude Lorrain, to which artist he often refers. While, however, Claude may, by the inclusion of a draftsman, have wished to reassure his viewers of the accuracy of the scene in his drawing, as a facsimile of what had stood before the draftsman's and his own eyes on a specific day in the year 1642, travelling from Subiaco to Tivoli, because that is here, what it says here, it states the exact day and everything, as a proof, as it were, and here the draftsman. Repton would seem to have quite a different motivation. Rather than recording a scene on paper, as he had in reality encountered it, Repton is always seen sketching a future view that he had, imaginatively as it were, created in his mind, like here. By portraying himself as an artist, he may rather have wanted to encourage the watercolor's viewer to take the same stance of looking at an improved landscape under an artistic perspective. See, for instance, how Repton, in a sketch for the Red Book for Woburn Abbey, captures a future first impression of the site, at the site of the proposed approach road to the Abbey, from where the massive building is seemingly embosomed in a magnificent wood, elevated and not depressed, and by its apparent quantity distinctly marking its character as a ducal palace. When prospectively drawing it himself, Repton may have wished to prove how worthy of a sketch this new scene on the new approach would be, and hence how correct his suggested approach road. Other than his programmatic trade card, of which we have already seen in the previous talk, which stock in all red books, more or less, also in sketches and hints generally. In this trade card that marked the start of his business as a landscape gardener, Repton never depicted himself planning or indeed executing landscaping works on the grounds. This absence of him being engaged in practical work is not all that surprising, as the red books generally were conceived and finished long before groundwork started, if they were undertaken at all. Also, an absence of the practical and messy business of, say, creating a lake only seems consistent in writings with theoretical aspirations, such as Observations on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening of 1803, where in the frontispiece, which is the picture here, Repton also rendered himself in his capacity as a draftsman. Even though Repton kept rating down the importance of his sketches verbally, he nonetheless endeavoured to attract subscriptions for his observations by highlighting the publication's numerous plates and illustrations with slides. Repton stressing his competence as a draftsman is hardly surprising if we also remember that he from the very start had defined this faculty of foreknowing effects as the core competence of his newly introduced profession of landscape gardening, previewing effects, though, such as they can only be rendered in a drawing. When showing himself or someone else drawing the improved state only, which Repton always does, this is not merely promoting the artistic potential of this recommended scene, it is also involuntarily true to Repton's procedure when generating a red book view with a flap. Here, he needed to fix the improved state first and only once this new perfect view was finished could reconstruct the status quo on the overlay. If really, as already John Claudius Loudon noted, Repton had been concerned with scientifically comparing the two states of the same scene, which Repton keeps saying he was, he could just as well have spared himself this extra trouble by simply copying the present state from the sketch made on the ground first, and then subsequently improve it on the overlay. But obviously Repton chose the more complicated procedure to induce a sense of revelation or of the ideal, or Loudon again, for while we know that the slip is capable of being lifted up, the mind will be in anxiety till that be effected. This, besides, may explain also why so many later owners of Repton watercolours felt pleasure in drawing their own reality overlays to prospective ideal views of their grounds that Repton had provided. This is an example of a loose drawing for the rectory in Sussex. This is a Repton watercolour of the ideal view, and some owner had provided a flap, which is not by Repton, as you can clearly see when you look at the cows, which had been stuck here to sort of give you that feeling so you can show it to your friends and they have the same revelation. And it's something you can find quite a lot also in red books, that owners have produced their own flaps if there were none before. If Repton, in his role as a staffage figure on red book sketches, puts away the drawing pad, he seems to turn into an interpreter. He, for instance, in the red book for Blaise Castle, states to be afraid that his sketches will only give little idea to the grand. He states that to be afraid that his sketches will only give little idea to the grand and sublime combination of rocks and trees, which he is endeavouring to display upon the spot without fatigue, and that may be brought before the eye when going round his suggested circuit. As Repton cannot provide a drawing of such overpowering scenes, he at least wants to be seen pointing out the picturesque potential of one of the ravines after his commissioners stepped out from the mouth of a cavern on that tour which Repton will propose him to follow. So this is a sketch with a hole. You lift it, and then you see what you see when you step out of the cavern, which is also one of the many devices Repton uses to make the experience of going through the garden actually perceivable in the red book as such. And as you step out, you see Repton here, how he shows this I cannot draw, but nonetheless it's a very worthy and picturesque scene. Less overpowered and hence able to provide a sketch, Repton strikes a similar interpretative pose in the red book for Warley, near Birmingham. How much? Yeah. Okay, so we leave that. Repton definitely wears the hat of a didactic watercolour instructor when concluding his red books with scenes added for the sake of artistic license. In the heydays of the picturesque controversy, Repton, for example, in the red book for Sufton Court, intends to demonstrate that he, despite the merely topographical, non-artistic pretensions of his red book sketches, is well aware of the charms of such landscapes as are capable of being represented by painting. He subsequently devises in Sufton, sketch 9, this one, a composition made with the painter's license from ingredients that were to be found in a previous sketch of a panoramic view from the house. Repton also verbally outlines the necessity compositional adaptation steps that an old master would have taken when converting a topographical rendering, and as such he wants his previous sketch to be looked at into painting, not neglecting to denounce the self-same attempting to realize such a picture in the views from the house as just one of the many absurdities Price allegedly had promoted. But even after the polemics had cooled down, Repton not only insisted on a difference between a landscape garden and a painting, but also on the different ambitions between solid topographical draftsmanship and the fancies of old master painting, as can be shown in an example from the Red Book for Burton Park in Sussex. Repton also provided a final take where he reworked one of his sketches that had previously been improved on a topographical level. A watercolour sketch with a view of the house over the water, so this is the previous sketch, is being reissued from a viewpoint that is little farther away and therefore encourages the self-same painter's license. Okay. While Repton's musing on compositional differences between a topographical drawing and an old master's painting so far remained merely illustrative, they can gain a more operative impetus. Not only does Repton get active when it comes to explaining his own renderings of future bayous, but he also vividly engages in being an instructor for drawings to be made by his clients. In the Red Book for Panshanger in Hertfordshire, Repton points out the artistic potential of a scene as improved by himself to an aristocratically pigtailed Earl Cowper, here, sitting on the ground with his sketchbook opened. A commissioner, by the way, who appears to have been an especially passionate gentleman artist, as we already encountered him sketching in the Red Book he had previously commissioned, the one for Two in Water. And my last example. Yet even when the picture's controversy was peaking, Repton, especially subtle for instance in the Red Book for Rieg and Clwyd, had promoted the impact of a future drawing potential in an estate after its improvements. From the top of a hill, we in a status quo share a shepherd's lonely gaze over a bleak mountain valley, but if we lift the flap, we do not only apprehend how admirably a new mansion has been embosomed into the new planted valley, but also that the shepherd is no longer on his own. Still bent on his walking stick, he now observes proficient draftsman's pad, who is busily sketching this all-changed scene, whose drawing potential must have caught his eye when ascending to a covered seat that Repton also had suggested for the site. When Repton, in his comments in the Red Book for Rieg, appears to join an ongoing debate about the hierarchical gap between the high art of painting and the polite art of drawing, one cannot help noticing that this is at quite some distance from what he, on his trade card, had defined his business to be. Repton is abandoning the part of a surveyor, his planning, or giving instruction in the terrain, swapping the garden designer's stance for one of a first viewer of his envisaged scenes. This future appreciation may become manifest by putting a drawing pad on his own knees, just as much as by turning himself into an interpreter of a scene he plans to stage. It is at its most palpable, however, when Repton, in adopting the part of a drawing instructor, helping an amateur draftsman to gather the artistic potential of scene after Repton will have laid it out. This education in viewing a garden properly is, in my eyes, one of the central appeals of Repton's Red Books for their readers. By integrating the voice and the standards by which an estate will be aesthetically judged from an external perspective, such as the stands adopted in Watts and Angus's Seeds collections, or indeed by a draftsman, into his proposals as a garden designer, I think Repton has, in the Red Books, created a truly original genre.
Well, it's reassuring to find that there's nothing modest about Mr. Repton, and that André shares many other people's sort of tongue-in-cheek presentation of the man himself. But that was absolutely stunning exploration of the work actually in the Red Books. So thank you very much. Okay, we've got 20 minutes for coffee, and I will be rigorous with you as I am with the speakers. It will be 20 minutes, and if you haven't finished, you have to spit it out. Remember, everything is downstairs, toilets and coffee, and if you are vegetarian, can you please make yourself known to Robert Peel during this break? Thank you very much. Can we have a bit of hush, please? Take your seats. Take your seats. Whilst we're sitting down, I can announce that England have won the rugby. In the last minute of extra time. I can also do a little bit more advertising. We have a couple of the delegates have brought along with them a complete facsimile of the Red Book for Nacton, and if you want to see that, the gentleman concerned will be lurking somewhere in the back room during the breaks. The Garden History Society has 12 copies of Repton, the Shire publication by K. Senecki. They're the last 12 copies in the country, and it's not going to be reprinted. So talk to Charles Boot if you would like to obtain a copy of that. And the Sussex Gardens Trust have copies of Humphrey Repton's Red Book for Little Green, and if you would like to buy a copy of that, you only have to part with £1 and talk to Sally Walker for that. Right, on with the business. It's now a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hazel Fryer, fellow landscape architect and garden historian, past chairman of the Association of Gardens Trusts. In her practice, working as an historic landscape architect, she's working on conservation plans for a number of places where Repton undertook commissions. I'm talking slowly because Hazel seems to have disappeared. Oh no, there she is. Hazel, welcome.
Well, good morning, and I hope you'll all be happy and optimistic now the results of the rugby have been heard. So I'll just canter along about Repton quite happily. I come from a slightly different direction. Initially, my first qualification was as a landscape architect. So I thought I wanted to see and I wanted to examine landscapes by Repton on the ground. I've been looking at his work now for about 15 years, and I've examined quite a body of Repton landscapes. But I thought today I'd like to tackle the problem which André flagged up of whether Repton was an advisor or whether he was actually an achiever. How much work did he actually achieve, and what were his results? Well, Repton stated in Fragments on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening, published in 1816, which was towards the end of his career, that he had advised at more than 400 sites. I presumed with this vast body of work that my task would be easy, but this was not to be the case. My research revealed contradictions in the previous understanding of the implementation of Repton's work. It became apparent that although his commissions are recorded and their locations known, the level to which they were implemented is far less certain. In many cases, Repton's productivity was comparatively low and echoed his own words when he stated that in the future he would be recognised not for his commissions on the ground, but for his published works. This lecture will attempt to establish whether this statement is substantially correct and whether Repton was actually an achiever or an advisor, as I said. In examining the published sources, I looked, one of the areas which was particularly useful in identifying Repton's commissions was the polite repository and the views that Repton provided for the polite repository. This was an almanac produced by William Peacock, and which to confirm Repton's figure of 400 sites. Between 1790 and 1809, Repton supplied a large range of tiny watercolours views to illustrate the polite repository. The views were all engraved by John Peltro. However, upon his death in 1809, Repton ceased to provide images, so it didn't cover the full extent of his career. And also in the first 2 years, in 1790, he produced such 6 views, of which only one was of a site that he'd visited. And in 1791, however, they were all sites that he'd visited and were recorded in his account book. So this is an excellent source for starting an examination of Repton's work. This is my local Repton site, which was never implemented, unfortunately. Well, I then turned to red books. When I started my study, it covered the 24 Midland counties. I haven't covered the whole country, I've just covered my own patch. Although when I was travelling around elsewhere, whenever I could, I ventured into other people's Repton landscapes. But using the polite repository, this identified a potential number of 220 sites at which Repton could have advised. Well, moving on to his red books. Repton's red books were his trademark, and it had previously been considered that these volumes were likely to document creative designs. But unlike Sheringham, shown here, this did not prove to be the case. In the early years, although Repton frequently used this method to represent his opinions, it did not guarantee his success in achieving his designs. In 1792, when he produced the Red Book for Honing, he is known to have produced more than 100 volumes. That's in the first 4 years. Although most of the volumes are quarto, as André mentioned, he moved into the 1900s, he produced a lot of more larger folio volumes. Well, not a lot, but a number. These included Brighton Pavilion, Hewell Grange, Longleat, Welbeck and Woburn. However, not all commissions have red books, and in the early 19th century, when Repton was producing exotic red books, he was also tackling a number of villa landscapes for which he produced Millie reports. And it's these reports that are often documented through Peacock's polite repository, which I illustrated before. Did I find that the red books established Repton as an achiever or a designer, or merely an advisor? It might be presumed from the secure, assured and confident manner in which he presented these volumes that they were evidence of a Repton landscape, not a Reptonian landscape. But this was not the case again. The Red Book as a piece of art history and as a social commentary are exceptional. But as a working tool, they were not. They were far less effective. In any landscape survey, it is necessary to consider the dynamic nature of landscape design and the change and decay which inevitably occurs. But the disparity between Repton's elegant views, illustrating his proposals, and the designs which exist on the ground was cause for concern. This was most apparent in the 24 Midland counties that I mentioned, and I have walked sites in Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Cambridgeshire, Cheshire, Derbyshire, Devon, Essex, Gloucestershire, Herefordshire, Leicestershire, Lincolnshire, Middlesex, Norfolk, Northamptonshire, Nottinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Rutland, Staffordshire, Suffolk, I'm nearly there, Warwickshire, Wiltshire and Worcestershire. And you would have thought by now I would have got quite fit. But I've also, as I mentioned, examined sites in counties outside the remit of my study. At one point, the corresponding evidence on the ground was so poor that I considered abandoning the study altogether. Can I go on to the next one? Don't know whether that would straighten a little. This is the slide of Great Chew, which Repton produced for Colonel Stratton in 1803. Well, this was a very complicated site because when Repton came, he produced a really elegant red book with designs for a new house in different styles, be it Grecian or Gothic. He also produced, this is the before view, and this is the after view. The house on the slope in the distance was achieved in the woodland, but not at this time. In between Repton and the implementation of Repton's work, Loudon came on the scene with his agricultural improvements, and impoverish the client. Whether the client was hoping to get money from Loudon to actually implement his houses that Repton had proposed, I don't know. But it wasn't until Matthew Mohsen bought the house in 1815 that we got substantial movement on the site. So how do you quantify this design? Because it was implemented 15 years after Repton had advised on the site. And if you walk around Great Tube, looking carefully, you can actually see many of the elements of Repton's design on the site. Not always where he suggested they should be, but there are elements there. What I needed to do in order to move forward was to establish a methodology for measuring Repton's designs, and to establish how you evaluated them, how they'd been undertaken, and to also obtain an insight into his working methods. I've examined on the ground a corpus of Repton's work, which amounts to over half of his known commissions or indicated commissions, and have attempted to define the differences between proposals and created landscapes. This investigation involved a two-pronged approach, where archival research was confirmed by landscape survey. As the search for the individual elements of Repton's commissions on the ground proved to be a more reliable method of identifying his designs and the level of their existence today. Where there was any evidence of a Repton landscape, I walked the site. This is Donington Park in Leicestershire, and this is a view of the earlier house. This is a before view of Repton's. I found it helpful to appraise Repton chronologically, to see where he came in the chain of landscape designers, because there were always either people before him or people altering his designs after him, people implementing his designs or part of his designs. It was never a clear playing field. When I walked the site, I examined topography, arboriculture, views and vistas, artifacts, landscape features, and circulation patterns, the normal thing that a landscape architect does when they go on site. It was also necessary to understand the philosophy of a designer who allowed clients to form the whole or only part of his proposals, which in almost every case produced a landscape of complete flexibility. So you could get 80%, 20%, sometimes 95% of a landscape. This also raises the question of whether the client, or his architect, or the agent, who could in many cases also implemented the design, had created a Repton landscape or merely improvised and produced his own Reptonian design. After bringing together a body of information, the following methodology was established to evaluate both Repton's work and assess the designer's influence and the formation of Reptonian landscapes. The 6 categories that I chose were landscapes that were predominantly complete, not totally complete, but predominantly complete. And the sites that I examined regardless of current condition. And this came to about 10% of the sites in my chosen area. The second category was approximately half completed, where 50% of Repton's design was implemented. And this totaled 15% of the sites in my trial area. This is 220 sites. Of this, 15% were more than 50% complete. So if you put the first 2 categories together, that's 25% of Repton landscapes were either half complete or substantially complete. I then went on to partially completed, where elements of the design were completed, but it was not substantially complete. And this was quite a big percentage. This was almost as big as the first 2 percentages together. It was 24.4 of the sites which were partially complete. But then I got to probably implemented. And this was a really difficult area because there were a lot, I mean, I spent hours. I mean, I've been researching Repton for, as I say, 15 years. And there were a number of sites where you tried and tried and tried, and you could, the elements of the landscape seemed to have Repton's stamp, but there was just no documentary evidence. So there was a very big section of probably implemented, which I put at 14.4%. So these are sites which circumstantial evidence and other indicators might suggest were Repton landscapes. But the not implemented were the biggest tranche of all. And sites that were not implemented in my study came to 30%. So 30% of all of the Repton landscapes I examined had not been implemented at all. I then got to a totally new category, which was Reptonian landscapes, because I found, and my percentage for this is slightly conservative, I found a number of landscapes where Repton's Red Book proposals and his ideas had influenced a landscape created by the owner or other designers. And this, I think, is a very important area of future study for his work. My research commenced at Stoney Abbey, which is half a mile from my own home. And it was the remnant of this 1,000-acre estate belonging to the Lee family where I first experienced Repton's highly ornamented design vocabulary. Stoney proved pivotal in learning to read these artistic landscapes, because you've got the double layer of the landscape that Repton's improving on the ground, the earth moving, the creation of the widened river-like lake in front of the house. And then you get these highly ornamental plantings and structures. And often you may find that the parkland landscape still remains, but the majority of the ornamented structures have gone. Stoney proved very much a learning curve for me. And I learnt through this estate to create a category for examining a single landscape. Here, Repton's proposals were implemented, although only in part. André, I'd like you to see this. This is Repton on the ground actually implementing a scheme. Repton returned periodically to Stoney over a period between 1808 and 1813 to supervise his works on the ground. He only came once a year, but to just check how they were going and make sure everything was in order. At the death of his client, the Reverend Thomas Lee, his commission was cancelled, was terminated. So here was Repton with half of this lovely landscape complete, with lots of sketches still in the archives or alternative suggestions. It was a job that he'd actually got his hands on and done, and then the client terminated it. So that was really, for him, I think, quite upsetting. But that Stoney wasn't to end there, because the reason the client terminated it was that he wanted to do the design himself. And he engaged C.S. Smith, who was a client of Sir Geoffrey Wyatt, not a client, a student who trained with Sir Geoffrey Wyattfield, to help him put the estate in place. So they continued together and created this ornamental landscape. The cottages of C.S. Smith, they created a 19th century deer park in picturesque style. They ornamented the whole 1,000 acres. But you find little things like this, because all of the other cottages and all of the other buildings have the C.S. Smith style, but this, which is Park Cottage, which is still in place, although a little battered around, is thought to be influenced by Repton, if not implemented by one of his sons, but not fully documented again. For a period of 50 years, the Lee family continued to improve the estate. This is the view that Repton took from the grove looking down towards the Abbey, and this was his concept for the estate. But 50 years later, I think the perspective is slightly distorted here because those terraces don't look quite as large as that. But this is the same view down, and the terraces were thought to be down by Nesfield. There's only one or two slight documentary references to him. But this is the view in 1858 when Queen Victoria was visiting. So the original Repton landscape was there, 50% was created. This was overlain by a Reptonian landscape, which was later overlain by other designers because Nesfield was there, and then this century Percy Kane came. So how do you find the elements of Repton that are still clear and remain? I assumed that this partial Repton landscape, completed in a Reptonian style, was unusual, but found that this design was not only a good example of Repton's work, but that it also illustrated his ideas, influencing the Reptonian landscape, which was completed after the commission was terminated. I learnt to search for Repton's designs in fragments of his work, examples of his designs carried out by others, and estates where his influence guided his clients, who often only partially followed the principles which were illustrated in the Red Book, and created their own landscapes to a Reptonian style. I would like to discuss the various levels of Repton's designs through examples of his work, in particular a vocabulary for dealing with fragmentary designs. For although there were substantially completed designs, there are some substantially completed designs, 10%, the large majority weren't substantially completed. What was a very interesting area, 5 or 10 minutes, I'm nearly there actually, was the level to which Repton was aided and assisted by his architectural associates. He worked with William Wilkins, John Nash, and Geoffrey and Samuel Wyatt, and lots of other architects. If I could just whiz you through Huell, where he worked, this is Ashridge, where he worked with Geoffrey Wyattville, which is perhaps one of the best known Repton landscapes improved by Geoffrey Wyattville. This is Aqualate, another example, where Repton, this is one of the only on-site sketches that he produced, but in the house, there are either Nash or George Repton sketches, which also have the flat drawings, which were mentioned, to show different designs for the house and different designs for the landscape. They're not Repton's work, but the design was actually completed by Webb in Repton style, and Webb was an advocate of Repton's work. But this is one job I'd like to see. I'll just try and walk through it quite quickly. This is Repton's plan, really efficient and easy to read. The main road is the orange line at the bottom of the picture. The approach was that way and through there. Repton wanted to change the approach to come from that direction and to come from this direction. That's the house there and the stable block. But it's quite a major improvement. The client didn't want to do it, but he liked the details. So he kept the road where it was and put Repton's bridge detail with the road going through. The architect Thomas Cundy created a real tennis court instead of the elegant designs for a conservatory that Repton had put forward. The quarry, which the road was to come through, the road didn't come through, but they did create a quarry garden. The quarry garden is still there, and you've currently got a super view through of the new house, which replaced the house that Repton was designing around. Well, this was really very interesting because this is the Red Book for Hilton. And why this is particularly interesting is when I discovered it, inside was a letter by Nash. which identified the elements that Repton had already carried out, made a very derogatory comment about Repton's handling of water and suggested he should be commissioned for the estate. But unfortunately, I don't know whether it was because of his nasty tone or because the client didn't have any money, but he didn't get the commission. Well, this is canons, and you may be familiar with canons, but this was something that I searched for weeks and weeks trying to find documentation for canons, and I couldn't. And yet you go into the park, and this is what you find. I don't know whether you'd like to have a look at this in comparison with the little peacock's polite repository drawing. I feel that canons is probably a Repton site. But I have mentioned Stoney Abbey. Perhaps I'll just go on. Shall I whip through the slides or stop? Come to a conclusion? Conclusion, right. Sure. Can go very fast. Well, I'll stop here and just make my conclusion then. Repton was a significantly influential figure. And he must be, because he was lampooned not only in the late 18th and early 19th century, but he's also lampooned today, which, Tim, I don't know whether you recognise. But the implementation of his work and the extent to which it was completed is a complex question. And as he frequently relied on others to complete his work, even more difficult. His designs evolved in a variety of styles and sometimes under a variety of hands, as at Tatton Park, which is acknowledged as one of his major landscapes, but was actually carried out by Samuel Wyatt 20 years later. With the accelerated process for development and change, the fragility of Repton's landscapes makes them particularly vulnerable. And I think it's essential to record these landscapes accurately, and in the terminology of today, it is important that Repton's master plans, which is really what they were, for estates are evaluated, for although his proposals may not have been put in place to the detail of his design, they do record his intentions for the landscape and retain the essence of his ideas. As I say, the rates of his change in historic landscapes is changing. We cannot prevent the fragmentation of estates, but what we can do is record Repton's landscapes and try and protect them. Thank you. I hope I haven't run over too much.
Hazel, thank you very much.